in the U.S. And so that's kind of where we stopped. And so tonight, what I want us to do is pick up with the 18th century and talk about some major events and people there. Hopefully, we'll work our way through both the 18th and 19th centuries tonight and maybe get started on the 20th. Awakening, hence the name, of spiritual practice and spirituality, and it's a pushback against the Enlightenment. It's an age of faith versus the age of enlightenment. People who are pushing back against kind of not necessarily the science itself, but the idea that science our interaction with that, and emphasizes this personal experience with God. The idea that we have a direct connection with the divine. And that becomes a primary factor of the Great Awakening, the first one. The earliest part of that, of the American phase, appears among Presbyterians in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The first Great Awakening is largely among the New England and Mid-Atlantic colonies. So New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, to some extent Delaware, Rhode Island, Virginia, that's kind of where most of this activity is. And remember, we're talking about the early 18th century to the mid, so 1730 to 1770, that's where most people live still, right? So we're still in the colonial era largely here. And that's where this is focused. It begins with a man named Reverend William Tennant, who's a Scots-Irish immigrant, and his sons are Presbyterians, and they go about conducting what today we would know as a revival. These kind of very demonstrative in their preaching, very upbeat and joyful singing, a call to a response, a call, an altar call, what we call it now, the invitation, which really, by the way, is a late development in terms of church history. That comes about in the revivalist practices of the First and Second Great Awakening, and something we still do today. In fact, a lot of our worship is still framed in what develops more in the Second Awakening. We'll talk about that in a minute, but out of these two major revival periods. So the Tennants go about conducting these revival meetings and developing quite a following, quite a fervor. And so they decide, along with some other folks, that they need a place to train preachers to conduct these revivals. And so they start something called the Log College. Does anybody know what the Log College is called today? Anyone? Not Harvard, but you're not far off. Princeton. Princeton's Presbyterian. Harvard would, they had their different church, well, not anymore, but they once were. So that's the beginning of Princeton University. A lot of colleges and universities are founded during the first and second awakenings in the U.S. And they were seen as places to train the ministers needed to carry on the work beyond these original handful of people. The enthusiasm kind of continued to spread into the other Presbyterians of the middle colonies. And then eventually it picks up Congregationalists or Puritans in New England, Baptists in Rhode Island get caught up in it. And by the 1740s, there's some evidence of these revivals in every one of the colonies, a little bit lesser in the Carolinas and in Georgia, partially because of the strong influence of the Church of England in those places. But there's evidence of it having spread throughout much of that region. So a couple of figures that are important in the First Great Awakening. One is a fellow named Jonathan Edwards. You know the name Jonathan Edwards? When I was in high school, one assignment in our American literature class was a sermon by Jonathan Edwards called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Have you ever heard that before? If you have never read it, it's available online. I encourage you to read it, and you will think I am a softie on Sunday morning once you have read that. One of the primary metaphors that he uses in there is that all we as sinners dangle like a spider on the end of a thread over the fires of hell. He was a fire and brimstone dude. Edwards was initially a Congregationalist or a Puritan theologian. He begins his work in Massachusetts, but he starts leading revivals around. And he very much defends the Reformed tradition throughout this. He remains a Reformed theologian. That's not always the case in the Awakening. A lot of these guys, their theology shifts as they move through these more kind of revivalist practices. Not so for Edwards. He was a committed theologian. He moves eventually to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. You may not think about it in this way, but Western Massachusetts is the pioneer area during the 18th century. So we have Edwards who moves out there to be a missionary to the Housatonic Indian tribe in Western Mass in Stockbridge. He eventually is chosen because of his reputation to become president of Princeton University, which he does for a very short period of time, I think only a few months actually, because he dies after complications from a smallpox inoculation. And so he dies at a fairly early age. It's in Enfield, Connecticut in 1741 that he publishes Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. There are a lot of Edwards sermons that are available. He has been preserved partially because of his connection with Princeton. They really went a long way to try to collect and preserve his writings. And he is a significant figure in the First Great Awakening and in church history. I will tell you, I'm not well-versed in Presbyterian tradition, but my friends who are Presbyterian ministers all have the collected sermons of Jonathan Edwards on their shelf. It is very much he's a foundational figure for them. The next is another fairly foundational figure whose name is John Wesley. Wesley was born in 1703. He died in 1791. He was born to Church of England minister Samuel Wesley and his wife Susanna. He was one of 10 living children that they had. She had 9 who did not survive into adulthood. John Wesley was number 15. If you think Susanna didn't know what she was doing, she was one of 25 born to her parents. So these were some large families that they had going on. That's a big family, isn't it, Mark? That's a lot of children. It is.
I bet it had a lot of grandkids.
But a whole bunch. A whole bunch. Yeah, John Wesley had a bunch of kids too. He picked up on the idea. John and one of his other siblings' name was Charles Wesley, who often gets overlooked but is probably equally significant. I'm not going to treat him that way here because we don't have time. But he probably is equally significant to John because he is the one who set all this to music. Charles Wesley was the great hymn writer. Love's divine, all loves excelling. That's a Charles Wesley tune in him. So, also significant. I have a good friend who's a pastor, a Methodist pastor in Georgia, and he is also something of a Wesley scholar. And his theory is that everything Wesley eventually develops in the church, he learns from his mother, Susanna. It is known that she was the one who basically discipled the children. The father was away doing the work of the church. She had daily interviews with her children as to their spiritual life. She is the one who organized them, and my friend David says that's where Wesley learned organization was from his mother with 10 children. You know, that he watched how she got everything done, and that's his theory anyway. Wesley is educated first at Christ Church, Oxford, and is a fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford. He's ordained in the Anglican Church in 1726. While he's at Oxford, he famously gathers a group of friends around him that they were called the Holy Club. And it's John, his brother Charles, and a man named George Whitefield that we'll talk about in just a moment. And they become later, not now, but 50 years later, the genesis of the Methodist Church are these fellows that meet at Oxford College in the 1720s. There are two pieces of what people describe as Wesley's conversion, because maybe you don't know, I think everybody may know, that John Wesley is the founder of Methodism as we know it today. And two things happen. One is what happens when he comes to America. Wesley in the 1730s decides to come to the U.S. and become an Anglican minister in Georgia, particularly to Savannah. On his way to Savannah, his ship is caught in a massive storm. And Wesley kind of panics. He kind of loses his religion, as you might say, in the moment, in the storm. And as he looks across the boat, he's on the same ship with a group of Moravian missionaries. And maybe you remember from that session a couple of weeks ago that the Moravians were a pietist sect that are older than the Reformation that had been conducting a 100-year-long prayer meeting in Herhut, where they were originally had a community. And the Moravians were going over to Georgia also as missionaries. And when he watched the Moravians, they were peaceful and calm. They were praying and singing hymns. And Wesley was impressed. And he basically decided in that moment, okay, they have something I don't have. They know something I don't know. Wesley goes on to take his post in Savannah, and it does not go well at all. The primary reason it doesn't go well is he takes a liking to a young lady born of the highest class of those who are there, and she rebuffs his requests and ultimately marries somebody else. And when they present themselves to the church, Wesley refuses them communion. Well, you can imagine what it would be like if certain families long tenured here at the church came forward for the Lord's Supper and we said, no, you can't have it. How long do you think I would be employed? Well, Wesley was sent back on the next ship to England. And so he comes back discouraged. He comes back very much doubting his faith. And he is on his way one night to a meeting of Moravians, because he's impressed and he wants to go hear what they have to say. And it's the 24th of May, 1738, and they are meeting at a place called Aldersgate. And outside the meeting, Wesley stops and listens, and of all things, they are reading the preface of Luther's commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. And Wesley famously records that his heart is strangely warmed. And he considers that his moment of full conversion. So he also, what doesn't often get reported, he had been very much impressed by a sermon, and on his way to that, stopped off at St. Paul's Cathedral where the choir was singing Psalm 130. A key phrase out of that psalm is, "God has called me out of the depths." And so those two experiences together kind of re-energized his call to the ministry and reset him on the course. Some key characteristics of Wesleyan theology that develop about this time, first of all, is his commitment to Arminianism. The Anglican Church is very much reformed in their theology, especially around how we're saved. Wesley, however, buys into Arminianism, adjusts it slightly, and so today there's even a category of theology we refer to as Wesleyan Arminianism. It's a slightly adapted version. He very much believes in sanctification. One of my favorite Wesleyan phrases is moving on toward perfection. Wesley believed that for all disciples to truly be disciples in Jesus, they had to be in the process of being sanctified, that they were moving toward perfection in all things. He also was a big proponent of small group discipleship. What we know today, now Wesley did not begin Sunday school. That's another fella in England. But what we know today of how Sunday school is organized very much is a product of kind of Wesleyan theology and practice. He also was a huge believer in itinerant ministry. Wesley was initially, when he came back to America, a circuit rider and would ride a horse around to preach in different places, as were most of the preachers of the Great Awakening. Wesley was an abolitionist, which was kind of rare in the 18th century. But he very much preached the abolition of slavery. He was inclusive of women and believed that women should be active participants in the clergy. He did not ordain any women, but he thought it was a good idea. He left that for somebody else, I suppose. And what we know Wesley for is this sense of ecclesiastical structure, the method of Methodism, the whole kind of the idea of what Methodists now call the connection, the way ministers move, the way they're chosen, which, by the way, is pretty much kind of fallen apart with the recent struggles that the denomination has had. But that generates with Wesley. That's a lot of dry information. So as I was confirming some of my facts about him today, I came across on the UMC website 10 fascinating facts about John Wesley and United Methodism. So this is like the Letterman top 10, except in reverse because I'm going to do the first one first. John Wesley wrote one of the all-time best-selling medical texts. It was called The Primitive Physic. It went through 32 editions in Europe. It was one of the most read books in England. 2, John Wesley coined the term agree to disagree. Among the early founders of Methodism, I said a moment ago, are John Wesley and a guy named George Whitefield, we're going to talk about in a minute. Whitefield was very much committed to a Reformed theology. Wesley was Arminian. And so at one point he said about Whitefield, there are many doctrines of a less essential nature. In these we may think and let think, and may agree to disagree. But meantime, let us hold fast the essentials. 3, John Wesley rode far enough on horseback to circle the earth 10 times. supposedly 250,000 miles. Wesley had serious doubts about his faith. We talked about that. And his mentor taught him, and he recorded this in a journal, preach faith until you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach faith. Interesting way of going about that. 5, Methodist was originally a derogatory term. We do know that. 6, Wesley counseled people to eat a little less than you desire. Now, Wesley did not have a weight problem. According to most historians, he weighed somewhere around 130 pounds. He was not a big guy. But he considered that to be a control of our desire to sin. It was a way of practicing control in the body. Remember, we're all moving on toward perfection. So it was a practical way of doing that. 7, Wesley never intended to split from the Church of England. That's true. The Methodist Church in the United States begins because of the American Revolution. Wesley is back in England, and when the Revolution occurs, the Anglican Church refuses communion to the former colonials. And so Wesley and eventually Francis Asbury, a name we know locally, comes over and they start the Methodist Episcopal Church to allow communion to be served by formerly Anglican members who are now Methodists. Barry? No. I mean, he was on St. Simon's at one point, but right, yeah. There's a monument there to Asbury, yeah, and where he lands. Number 8, Wesley never said the most famous quote attributed to him. Maybe you've heard this before. Do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, as long as ever you can. Almost always attributed to Wesley. Historians say there's no evidence that he ever said or wrote that. Still good. Still a good idea. 9, Wesley believed you could not be a Christian on your own. He believed in social holiness, that it's together that we are the church, and that it's not possible to truly practice the life of following Christ on your own. 10, Methodism grew from 4 to 132,000 members in Wesley's lifetime. There were when he died, there were 72,000 in Britain and 60,000 in America. So, a few fascinating facts. Asbury, by the way, comes to America in 1771. George Whitefield, spelled Whitefield, pronounced Whitfield, 1714 to 1770. He was one of those Holy Club friends of Wesley, but differed with him on a couple of things. One was the means of salvation. The other was that while Wesley was an abolitionist, Whitefield was a slaveholder. Particularly, he had a plantation in Georgia that funded his orphanage that he established just outside of Savannah. Whitefield was best known for his outdoor preaching prowess, considered the finest of the preachers of the First Great Awakening, which is interesting because we don't have a lot of information about his actual sermons, but that was his reputation at the time. He also had a peculiar friendship with Benjamin Franklin, which I find incredibly odd. Knowing what we know about Benjamin Franklin, the fact that he would be good friends with a fire and brimstone Methodist preacher is kind of funny to me. I can only imagine what they talked about. Around that same time, we have a woman named Sarah Osborne, 1714, 1796. She was in Newport, Rhode Island, a part of the kind of New England portion of this. And in the first church of Newport, she began to preach. Did you hear what I said? 1760s. She was preaching in the church in Newport, Rhode Island. She formed something called the Religious Female Society, and she encouraged women to be trained to lead Bible studies and to lead prayer times, and she even sent some out as interim preachers to the church. Significant leadership in that day. She was considered equal to Edwards and Whitefield among those who heard her. Her role as a born-again woman kind of leads this concept from the First Great Awakening into more of issues that come up in the Second Great Awakening, for instance, women's suffrage. She kind of plants the seed for that. Another figure to note from the First Great Awakening is David Brainerd. David Brainerd was, I think, fair to say, one of the first well-known missionaries, in part because his journal was published. Brainerd was a missionary to the Delaware Indians of New Jersey at first, and then in western Massachusetts. Missionaries like William Carey, Jim Elliot, and some of Brainerd's family, especially Second Great Awakening evangelist James Brainerd Taylor, all cite Brainerd as an inspiration. He actually died at the home of Jonathan Edwards in Northampton, Massachusetts. His journal was one of the early American bestsellers. People still today refer to Brainerd's journal when they're talking about prayer. He knew a lot about specifically the power of prayer. So that's the First Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening, 1790 to 1840, thereabouts, characterized by the growth of the church in the frontier. So First Great Awakening is kind of in New England, in the coastal colonies. Second Great Awakening, what we see is that moving into Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, all in that area. So remember, this is still frontier territory at that point in time. Revival meetings, camp meetings. Have you ever been to a camp meeting? You know what a camp meeting is? Outdoor, under a big tent or under a big tree. Outdoor, people gather and is preaching and singing and all that kind of thing. And what we see during this period is the explosion of various denominations that are familiar to us now, but really come out of the Second Great Awakening, the movements around it. Here are just a few. Cumberland Presbyterian Church, the Disciples of Christ that we know as the Christian Church, the Church of Christ, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church we talked about a moment, the Adventist movement, the Holiness movement, Restorationists like the Shakers and the Latter-day Saints. All of those come along during the Second Great Awakening. Here's some, here's some names. We're going to go back and talk about a few of these, but to kind of give you a sense of the breadth of this thing, Richard Allen, who's the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, we'll talk about him in a minute. Francis Asbury, we've talked about him already. Henry Ward Beecher, Congregationalist minister. It happens to be the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, you know that name, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Again, it's this abolitionism is growing now in the Second Great Awakening. Antoinette Brown Blackwell was a Congregationalist. She was the first ordained female minister in the United States. Alexander Campbell, a Presbyterian early leader of the Restoration movement. Thomas Campbell, his brother. Peter Cartwright, Lorenzo Dow, Timothy Dwight, Charles Grandison Finney, who we'll talk about in a moment, who was a Presbyterian and an anti-Calvinist. That should raise an eyebrow. It should. Also was the second president of Oberlin College. A minister named Black Harry Hosier, who was a Methodist. He was the first African American to preach to a white congregation. Adoniram Judson, who is significant in Baptist life, early Baptist missionary. We'll talk about him more with Baptist history. Ann Lee. Do you know who Ann Lee is? There's a connection to Kentucky, at least to where they wound up. Shakers. Ann Lee was the mother of the Shakers. Jarena Lee, who was a Methodist female AME circuit rider. William Miller, the leader of the Millerites, who we don't talk about much, but it's the beginning of Adventism. The Adventist Church begins with William Miller. Benjamin Randall, who founds the Free Will Baptist. Luther Rice, another Baptist missionary to India. Joseph Smith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What many people don't know, some people know kind of the founding of the Mormon Church. What people don't know is that Joseph Smith was a minister in the Restoration movement prior to that. It kind of is called out of that in his way of speaking. Barton Stone, who is a Presbyterian, factors in locally especially. Nathaniel William Taylor and Ellen G. White, who was considered a prophetess of the early Seventh-day Adventist Church. Lots of just figures. We're going to talk about some of them now. One of the major developments in the 19th century, and particularly in the Second Great Awakening, is the emergence of the Free African American Church. Up until that time, for the most part, African Americans had been in church with Caucasian, with European people, for the most part, when they were allowed away from the property where they were enslaved, if they were enslaved. But even if they were free, they were often included along with Europeans. And one of those was a fellow named Richard Allen. And Richard Allen was born in 1760, died in 1831. Allen was born into slavery in Delaware, but was taken in by the Methodist Church and considered to be a potential minister. And over time, with some help from some folks in the church, he bought his freedom and eventually was ordained as a minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church. The problem was that they would only let him preach to other African folks. They wouldn't let him preach to Europeans. And so he developed a 5 a.m. prayer meeting on the center, in the center green, if you will, of Philadelphia, and began to hold meetings there. And he started out with 50, and eventually they became several hundred. And if you can imagine this, the ironic juxtaposition of this picture, that while Richard Allen and some of his friends in the Methodist Church are trying to integrate that church in Philadelphia, where they want to have the two ethnic groups worship together, and they're protesting for that, at the same time that the Constitutional Congress is meeting in Independence Hall. Let that sink in for a minute. Eventually, one Sunday, and it may not have happened on a Sunday, I'm not sure, I can't remember the actual date. A group of those who'd been worshiping with Allen decide they're going to go in and pray at St. George's Church, which is where he was a minister. They are... Did you call somebody to ask for help? Did you? Oh, okay. They essentially carry them out physically. And at that point, Allen decides it's time for us to have our own church. So he starts the Bethel community, which eventually becomes Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. And that's the beginning of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in America, founded by Richard Allen.
Are Methodist Church today still called Methodist Episcopal?
No. And that changes, actually, that doesn't change until the 60s when the United Methodist Church comes into being. United Methodist Church, the denomination as we used to know it, is a relatively recent development. It's a collection of all these different churches. But the African Methodist Episcopal Church is still a viable denomination. There are multiple AME churches here in Lexington.
Oh, is the AME?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. That's the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal. Yep, that's right. So, just a couple of other key dates in there. 1783, George Lyle becomes the first ordained black pastor in America. And in 1787, Lemuel Hayes becomes the first black pastor to lead a white congregation. He's a veteran of the American Revolution, and he pastored in congregational churches in Connecticut and Vermont. Another key figure in the AME movement early on is a woman named Jarena Lee. She was born in 1783. We don't actually know exactly when she died. But she became a preacher with the approval of the endorsement of Richard Allen. She went to him and said, I feel called to preach. And he said, no, you don't. And she said, yes, I do. And he said, no, you don't. And she said, I really do. And he said, okay, maybe you can. And he let her preach, and she was so good at it, he said, I can't deny it anymore. She's also African heritage. And so he sent her out. She was an itinerant pastor in the AME church. And in 1836, she's the first African-American woman to publish her autobiography in the U.S. Then as we turn into the 19th century, the revival of 1800, as it is known, begins in Logan County, Kentucky, at the Red River Meeting House. And this is the first of these meetings, largely conducted by Presbyterians initially, although it became kind of an ecumenical activity. And perhaps the most famous of the meetings happened really close to here. Anybody know? Cane Ridge Revival. Cane Ridge Revival starts in 1801, and it leads to the Restoration Movement, which begins in 1811. You may also know the Restoration Movement as the Stone Campbell Movement, or as it's known in Baptist churches across Kentucky and Tennessee, the Campbellite Heresy. Depends on which side of that you're on. But Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell are coming out of this revivalist movement that starts over at Cane Ridge, and they consider themselves restorationists. And by that, they were trying to restore the church to its New Testament pattern. They wanted to get back to, they said, being a New Testament church. So out of that restoration movement, today we have the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which are non-Calvinist Presbyterians. In other words, they follow the Presbyterian teachings, but not as it relates to salvation. They are not predestinationist. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church is started in Dixon, Tennessee. And as far as I know, I would say 90% of those churches are in West Central Tennessee and West Central Kentucky. I don't know of Cumberland Presbyterians too far outside of that, because most of them are somewhere around the Cumberland River. That's kind of how they got the name. The other major groups that come out of that are the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ. And they are coming out of the Stone Campbell movement. That starts as a Presbyterian movement, doesn't stay that way, because they very quickly reject the Reformed position on salvation. They're much more Arminian in their approach. And so it's joined pretty quickly in terms of these revivals by some of the Methodists, but not the Baptists, because the Baptists felt like the whole thing was far too disorderly. Because these are fairly charismatic meetings. They go on forever, and we all know Baptists try to get to lunch on time. They go on a long time. They're loud. There's a lot of demonstrative worship. There's a lot of what we would later identify as Pentecostalism. Kind of is happening in spots, and the Baptists don't like it. And the Baptists particularly don't like it because it's incredibly popular. And people are flocking out to these meetings. And so Laura and I were members in our college in young adult days at First Baptist downtown in Nashville. There's a whole chapter in the history of First Baptist downtown Nashville called the Campbellite Heresy. And it about wiped that church out. After it went through there, they had, I think it was 8, was that right? It was like 8 or 10 members left after that went through. So Baptists have a different view of that movement. Our folks, our brothers and sisters in the Christian church, this is their foundation. This is where they begin. This is their origin story. And again, the idea was to get back to what it meant to be a New Testament church. And so, for instance, in the Church of Christ, that most of my family was a part of, except for my grandparents and my little family, they practiced baptism on the same methodology as the Ethiopian official. You give your life to Christ. Here is water. Why wait? It's in the moment. You present yourself as a candidate for baptism, you're baptized right then. They also make the argument that there were no instruments in the New Testament, so there are no instruments in their worship. Now, that's not true of the Christian church. They don't practice that way. It's also not true of every church of Christ. There are instrumental and non-instrumental churches of Christ. Very big, again, huge in Middle Tennessee. Huge churches of Christ in Middle Tennessee, right? Right, Terry? They're everywhere. Same thing in Western Kentucky. You know, it's a huge influence there. All comes out of the Cane Ridge Revival. That's where all of that starts. 1814, slightly after that, is the first Triennial Baptist Convention. This is the beginning of kind of the organization of Baptist churches. It's partially in response to this movement. Baptist leaders get together and we need to get our act together. We need to figure out who we are. And so they begin that. It doesn't last terribly long. We'll talk about why in just a minute. Charles Finney, I talked about him a moment ago in the list. He is one of the key preachers known in the Second Great Awakening, 1792 to 1875. Presbyterian minister. He is known as the father of old revivalism. He preached largely still in New England, in New York. The First Great Awakening was so effective in New York, they had a district up there known as the Burned Over District, which meant that it had been so covered in hellfire and brimstone that it was essentially burned over. That's how intense the First Great Awakening had been in that part. He was an abolitionist. As I said, he winds up at Oberlin College in Ohio. I don't know how much you all know about Oberlin, but Oberlin was one of the first colleges to admit women and people without considering race. So they were integrated both in terms of gender and the race very, very early on. And he's the president there from 1851 to 1865. Oberlin students also played quite a role in the Underground Railroad. So the Second Great Awakening is this incredible explosion, and it leads right into the Civil War. And so what was a blossoming kind of understanding of faith within the United States runs smack dab into the issue of slavery and the divisions that are within the country. And unfortunately, that divides the churches. We'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks, but the Southern Baptist Convention becomes the Southern Baptist Convention because these churches pull away from the Triennial Convention because the Triennial Convention refuses to commission missionaries who hold slaves. So the Southern Baptist Convention forms in 1845 in South Carolina, largely on the basis of supporting slaveholders as missionary and clergy. If you study much at all around religion in the Civil War, you'll find that there is great support for both churches, for both segments of the country, in churches across the country. It is really a fascinating study in how much our own desires and our own understanding of the way life ought to be can form how we read the Scriptures. Because you could find, sermons all across the South. They exist in the North too, by the way. All across the South in absolute defense of slavery. And they cite, Onesimus. They cite Paul's admonitions for slaves to obey their masters. All these kind of things. There are also widely across the North and a good many churches in the South where you find sermons that say slavery is abhorrent and shouldn't be conducted. Within the church, it's not a North versus South completely. There are a lot of voices that are in the opposition in both places. But the momentum that the Second Great Awakening had is completely destroyed with the Civil War. Because it just resets everything in the country at that point. And among that is what's happening in the churches. After that, you begin to see kind of the birth of a new evangelism that comes out of the Civil War. A couple of developments that I want to point to tonight, and then we'll kind of wrap up. The first is a fellow named Dwight L. Moody. Moody is born in 1837, dies in 1899, born in Massachusetts. And his ministry begins during the war as a representative of the YMCA. The YMCA sent chaplains into the war zones, and Moody was one of those. He was a conscientious objector when it came to military service, considered himself initially perhaps something of a Quaker, decided that he couldn't participate in that, but he visited battle zones across the country and ultimately takes up a very evangelistic approach to ministry. Maintained a very strict biblical interpretation that was literal, and a dispensationalist eschatology, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Moody, of course, he doesn't start, but he winds up in Chicago, forms the Chicago Bible School with his friend Ira Sankey, and eventually they changed their name after his death to the Moody Bible Institute. That's founded first in 1886. Some of you may know that his, I believe, great-grandson was a member here at Calvary for a long time. Is now a pastor in Florida. Dwight Moody, actually, was his name. Moody is a significant figure in the shift to what becomes evangelicalism in the United States. A lot of that begins with Moody and his understanding of, again, back to the ideas of the Second Great Awakening, personal experience, all of that, but very much a gospel-focused ministry as it relates to what the church should be about. The other major development that I want to mention tonight in that same period is something called dispensationalism. Are you familiar with that term? Dispensationalism? Some are. It's not. They're developed, and it kind of comes from the teachings of a guy named John Nelson Darby, who lived in the 19th century. He's kind of considered the father of dispensationalism. He was in England and Ireland in the 1830s as a minister. And the original concept was that God, it's about kind of salvation history, that God has dealt with creation and humanity in different dispensations, that there are different eras that are not fully connected to one another. Now, dispensationalism in that form hasn't necessarily survived fully that way, but it got picked up by a guy named Scofield, who developed a study Bible and kind of codified dispensationalism in the notes of that study Bible, in that outlook. Scofield is picked up by a guy named Ryrie, who also developed a study Bible. And some of you may have a Ryrie study Bible. I have one in my office. I've had one for years. And it has in it this kind of dispensational roots. Now, by the time it gets to Ryrie, it's not so much the 5 dispensations, which is what Darby taught, but it's 2. And the idea is that there was a completely separate, a bright line between the Old and New Testaments. That whatever happened before Jesus no longer matters to us. It's kind of the two, you might hear it in terms of the 2 covenant theology, or there are a lot of different ways you might hear about that. But the idea was that as Christians, we are no longer subject to the law, consistent with the teachings of Paul in the New Testament. No issue with that. But it sometimes it goes so far as to say that what's there doesn't matter, that it doesn't apply to us at all, which I think, to me, degrades the larger, beautiful picture of salvation history that begins in creation and ends in new creation. But it puts this dividing line in there. What the kind of eschatology of dispensationalism also involves kind of a post-millennialist perspective, and we don't have time to get into what all that means tonight. But it comes out more recently to us in some of the modern understandings of the end of time that we find in a book like The Late Great Planet Earth. Anybody remember reading that? Or the Left Behind series. Those Left Behind books, LaHaye and all that, that's dispensationalism. That's where it's rooted. That's where it comes from. And so it's a very influential, really, in 20th and 21st century Christianity, but it's not something we talk about. It's something that Baptist theologians, run away from for some obvious reasons, and we don't have, that's not a thoroughgoing exploration of dispensationalism, but it very much was a development out of the 19th century and out of the Great Awakening. Moody starts out as a dispensationalist but moves away from it because he can't see how it connects with what he's understanding to be God's intent in Christ and salvation. He very much sees all of that as one story, and that our response to it is a personal response that we make back to Jesus Christ. So, again, another night drinking from the fire hose. The good news is the 20th century is less complicated, more names but less complicated, and probably more familiar, things that'll be more easily recognizable. Then we'll move from that into Baptist history specifically. I've been telling you, we'll come back to that when we talk about, we'll come back to that when we talk about that. So next week we'll finish up the church in America, and then we'll go back and kind of trace the thread of Baptist history. And then after that, we're going to have some special guests coming through and sharing kind of their particular areas of research. And I think that's going to be fun too. All right? Thank you all for being here. Let me pray for us and we'll go. God, as we continue to look at your story and how you have been at work, so many people who have in their own way tried to be faithful to your call. They haven't always agreed. Sometimes they've just agreed to disagree. But every one of them have moved your work forward simply because of a faithful response. So may that be a lesson to us, oh God, that we're not always going to agree with everyone. But if we're being faithful, then your work moves forward. So help us to faithfully follow you every day. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Good night.